Okay, let's jump right into this fascinating explainer. We often hear about artificial intelligence as if it's this objective, all-knowing oracle, but actually, it's more like a digital mirror reflecting our own historical and cultural biases right back at us. Today, we're unpacking some incredible insights from a recent deep dive university lecture on AI and literary interpretation. It is a profound look at what actually goes into the machines we use every single day, and I can promise you it's going to completely change how you look at your next chat prompt. So, is artificial intelligence truly neutral? We tend to just assume technology is completely unbiased, right? But let's question that assumption right out of the gate. When you type a question into an AI, you probably picture a hyperlogical, perfectly neutral brain just calculating the absolute perfect answer in a sterile room somewhere. But as we're going to see today, that virtual space, it isn't sterile at all. It is built entirely from our messy, real world.
The really crucial thing to remember is that AI models are trained on massive data sets created by humans. That means they inherently inherit our unconscious biases. Think about human psychology for a second. We all instinctively categorize people and things based on mental preconditioning, past experiences, and societal norms, usually without even realizing it. Well, AI algorithms absorb these exact same flaws from the text we feed them. When developers adjust the parameters of an AI, they're essentially mapping out human language. So the AI doesn't just invent bias out of thin air. It literally learns the structure of human prejudice from us, and then treats our subjective historical opinions as absolute objective facts.
Here's exactly what we'll be covering in this explainer. First, the myth of neutral AI. Second, gender bias in AI. Third, racial bias in algorithms. Fourth, political bias and control. Fifth, missing voices in data. And finally, making AI biases visible.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the myth of neutral AI, where we'll be shattering the illusion of the objective machine. To really grasp this, we have to move way beyond the obsolete idea that a problem is just a simple two-sided coin. When we analyze a societal issue or a massive data set, it is virtually never just good versus bad or right versus wrong. Human history, and by extension the data that powers artificial intelligence, is more like a complex, multidimensional diamond. Every single angle you look from reflects a slightly different light, a different historical context, or a unique cultural nuance. So to really understand what an AI is giving us, we can't settle for flat, two-sided answers. We have to challenge assumptions, demand evidence, and actively seek out diverse perspectives to see that whole multi-dimensional picture.
Moving right along to Section 2, Gender Bias in AI, looking at the feminist critique of algorithms.
Let's treat this like a live experiment for a moment. Imagine asking an AI to write a Victorian story about a scientist. What kind of character do you think it automatically generates? Seriously, think about it for a second. If you don't explicitly tell it the gender of that scientist, what exactly is the machine going to default to?
Well, this ties perfectly into Gilbert and Gubar's feminist critique. Back in 1979, these literary critics analyzed male-dominated traditions and pointed out how historical texts constantly forced women into extreme binaries. Basically, women were cast as either helpless, submissive angels or erratic, hysterical monsters. Now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with modern tech? Well, generative AI models are fed centuries of public domain literature to learn how to speak and write. Since that historical data is overwhelmingly male-dominated, the AI just inherits and recycles this exact same patriarchal canon as its baseline reality.
And sure enough, in live tests from the source lecture, when prompted for a story about a brilliant scientist, the AI almost always defaulted to a male protagonist. It would spit out something like Dr. Edmund Bellum, a physician and natural philosopher. It's kind of wild when you really think about it. The machine associates intellectual, scientific discovery heavily with men, simply because the sheer volume of classical literature taught it to do so. It has zero concept of equity. It only understands probability. Unless explicitly instructed otherwise, the virtual world just mirrors the biases of the real world.
Now let's dive into Section 3, Racial Bias in Algorithms, and the very real danger of stochastic parrots.
You might have heard AI models described as stochastic parrots. Researcher Timnit Gebru warns that these large language models often just blindly amplify the existing racial and cultural biases found directly in their massive training datasets. You see, a stochastic parrot doesn't actually understand the meaning or the gravity of the words it's saying. It's essentially just doing really complex math to calculate the probability of which word should come next, based entirely on the text it was initially fed. So if that baseline text contains heavy Eurocentric biases or historical prejudices, the AI isn't going to magically filter them out. The parrot just repeats them back to us, often way louder and wrapped up in the false authority of a computer system. As the saying goes, more data doesn't mean better data. The crucial takeaway here is that feeding a machine a larger history book doesn't erase systemic racism. In fact, it often just reinforces the loudest, most dominant voices. Think of it like this. Making a bigger poetry anthology doesn't automatically mean it's more diverse. In the same way, pouring trillions of words into a language model doesn't fix a bias problem if the underlying data is heavily skewed toward one specific demographic. The quantity of the data can never replace the quality and diversity of that data.
And we see the consequences of this when we look at the real-world error rates of commercial AI systems. The reality is pretty stark. AI often sees whiteness as a default and struggles significantly with marginalized identities. In one highly notable study analyzing gender classification software, the error rate for identifying white men was virtually non-existent, less than 1%. But for dark-skinned women, that error rate jumped staggeringly to up to 34%. The algorithm simply wasn't trained on enough diverse visual data, which directly impacts its real-world accuracy and proves how data gaps have massive, tangible consequences.
All right, moving to Section 4, Political Bias and Control. Let's impartially compare some algorithmic guardrails.
If we impartially observe this live experiment from the lecture, we see a huge contrast in how algorithms are constructed across the globe. On one side, the US-based model from OpenAI freely generates open-ended political satire, like poems about world leaders such as Trump, Putin, or Kim Jong-un. But on the other side, the Chinese-based model DeepSeek is explicitly programmed with strict guardrails. When asked about sensitive political histories, it plainly responds, "That's beyond my current scope." What this tells us is that bias isn't just accidental or about missing data. AI models are also heavily shaped by deliberate algorithmic guardrails. These are intentional boundaries engineered by humans to control what the machine is and isn't allowed to output, totally dependent on regional political environments.
Let's shift gears to Section 5, Missing Voices and Data, looking at extractive epistemologies and the Global South.
We're facing some massive data gaps in AI right now. The current system heavily privileges quantitative, dominant Western data. What that means is the Global South and indigenous knowledge are severely underrepresented. If regional knowledge, like classic Indian literature, isn't heavily digitized, the AI either ignores it completely or treats it inconsistently. For example, it might treat Western historical concepts as hard facts, while categorizing ancient global texts, like the flying chariot, the Pushpaka Vimana from the Ramayana, strictly as myth. Plus, there's this extractive nature to how these systems are built. When digital material from the Global South is used, AI companies often scrape and borrow it without citing, crediting, or compensating the original authors.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Making AI Biases Visible. We need to transition from being digital downloaders to cultural uploaders.
We are great downloaders but poor uploaders. This quote gets straight to the heart of why this entire topic matters so deeply to you and me. If our diverse, unique stories aren't in the database, we can't really blame the AI for missing them. We consume incredible amounts of digital content every single day, constantly scrolling, reading, downloading, but how often are we actively contributing our own authentic voices? If regional languages, local histories, and diverse cultural narratives aren't being actively digitized and published by us, the AI simply has a massive blind spot. It literally has nothing to learn from.
So how do we combat these biased, extractive systems? Well, we can follow these 3 steps. First, recognize that AI is not a neutral oracle. It's a mirror, not a magic truth machine. Second, critically evaluate its prompts and outputs. In daily life, if an AI gives you a summary that relies heavily on a harmful cultural trope, you need to recognize that flaw and challenge the prompt to get a more nuanced answer. And third, we need to upload and digitize diverse regional stories into the ecosystem. The ultimate solution is feeding the digital world with rich, authentic human experiences.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, vital question. Will you step up and tell your story? Will you stop being just a consumer of data and start uploading your own unique perspective to help change the algorithm? The danger of a single story is incredibly real, but the power to diversify the machine's mind lies entirely in our hands. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.